Alrighty. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining on this very crispy Tuesday morning. My name is Alex Steffen. I am from Steffen Town Planning. If you've joined this webinar, you probably know who I am. Private consultant town planner, director of Steffen Town Planning, founder of Properties, which is an online app that tells you the development potential of a property with the click of a few buttons. I'm also the director and founder of URPEC. URPEC is the Urban and Regional Planning Education Centre. So I advocate and educate town planners, building designers, architects, certifiers. So we have a lot of online courses. Definitely Google URPEC if you're interested in learning more things like this. Just a quick about us. We've been operating in the East Brisbane area. We've been around for 13 years with 40 plus years of experience in our office with 6 or 7 staff, including a development manager. So a lot of wealth of experience in our office. We're just along Stanley Street, as you can see here in the background. So always happy to have a chat. Before I jump into it, if you've got any questions, please throw them in the Q&A box. There's a little chat box there, so you can put some questions in there and we'll get to them at the end or throughout, depending on what the question is. And feel free to throw some chat in the chat bar too. And I'll hopefully see it if I'm not caught up and giving you some good information. So what does Steffen Town Planning do? I'm kind of going to go through all the administrative stuff beforehand. So Steffen Town Planning, we gain development approvals for people through local council. So for example, subdivisions, extensions, new houses, townhouses, apartment buildings, special industry, whatever it is, we can pretty much deal with it. We only operate in Queensland, so sorry if you're outside of Queensland, but we can refer you to other planners who operate in those in the other states. We also provide development consulting services. So if you don't know what you want to do, but you have a good site, then let us know and we can have a look into the options for you. We also coordinate developments. We're not project managers, but we manage your project so we can take it right from the start, right through to plan ceiling for subdivisions. So that's a really good service that we offer, very affordable, and can make sure you save a lot of money on those kind of little intricate things that people might not know about. We do a lot of due diligence reporting. If you want to buy a site and you want to know what you can and cannot do with it, want to know what the issues are, we can deal with that. Show cause matters. If you've done something wrong and you've received a show cause notice, then you'll know what show cause matters means. So if you ever get a notice from council that says that you've done something wrong, give us a call. We do public consultation, as do a lot of planning firms. And we're Risk Smart accredited everywhere that you can be. So Risk Smart's just a fast track process. So for example, character houses and smaller houses, what we're talking about today, we can sometimes get those approved in a week. So very handy service. And there's a nice picture of me. That's me all day, every day, climbing a stack of paper. So today, let's get into it. We're doing a masterclass today. We did our last one in collaboration with Giraffe, which is based out of Sydney, and that was on subdivisions. And the feedback we got from that was overwhelmingly positive. So we thought, let's do another one. We put a suggestions box up, and people wanted to know about dwelling houses in Brisbane. It is one of the more complicated things we do as town planners, surprisingly. We have senior planners join us who have been town planners for 10 years, and you throw them a character house and they have absolutely no idea. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is a general overview of what we'll be covering so you can, get familiar. So we'll be talking about character houses, what they are, why they're protected, how they're protected, what kinds of character houses there are, how to identify one, what requires approval from council, what doesn't require approval from council, a list of prescribed accepted development. So that's, again, things that exempt from council assessment, and a bit of a checklist for you to take into account with any new design. We'll then talk about small lot houses. What is a small lot? What provisions of the codes apply? A review of the prescribed accepted development. Again, things that don't require approval. And then we'll talk about just other issues that really play into housing. So overlays, heritage things, fire safety, things that aren't necessarily a character house or a small lot concern, but then play a big part in potentially triggering a development application. We'll then have a decent amount of question time at the end. So if you have some questions, please type them into the Q&A box whenever you think of it, because we will try to get to it at the end. If we don't, we'll see if we can address it afterwards and send you an email. This will be recorded, Eugene. So at the end of this, you will get a copy and a link to download this. If you haven't registered for this webinar, you will not get that link. So the only time you'll see this is if you're actually attending here in person, or if you've registered and you can't necessarily make it. So, character houses. What is a character house? Hang on, let me move my little chat bar here. So a character house is, in council's eyes, it's any building constructed pre-1947. So it doesn't actually necessarily need to be a house. It could be a shed, could be a garage, could be an outbuilding. That is essentially what covers a character house. So if it's not built pre-1947, council don't care about it. Why are they protected? Through the Brisbane blueprint that council did. They did a massive survey, it was probably 2 or 3 years ago now, and they came up with this Brisbane's Better blueprint, and that basically uncovered that people really value character houses, not only for sentimental value, but just for, you know, general amenity and the way that people like living in Brisbane. So that means council then want to protect them. How are they protected? This is done by planning scheme overlays. So overlays being, you know, traditionally an overlay is something like a flood overlay, heritage, biodiversity, environmental significance. So they also have overlays for character. The main ones being the traditional building character overlay. That's probably the most common. That used to be called the Demolition Control Precinct, or a DCP. So if you're a bit older like me, then you'll be aware of that. So that's probably the main overlay that you're going to encounter. The second one is the pre-1911 building overlay. That's kind of the traditional building character overlay on steroids, really. So it's not only saying that this house is potentially pre-war, it's pre-World War I, and has, you know, it's kind of late colonial and has a much higher level of protection. Worthy of mention too, there is the commercial character building overlay. So that usually covers a pre-1947 building that's used for commercial purposes. So if you look at, you know, like along East Brisbane where we are, there's those old buildings built right up to the curb with the awning over the street. They also have a similar level of protection as to what we're talking about today. And then the obvious one, heritage overlays, local and state. That might not necessarily even be a pre-1947 house or building, but it most definitely means it has the same level of protection. So what kind of character houses are there? I thought before we go into, you know, what you need approval for, what you don't need approval for, it's probably a good idea that we just get a bit of a grasp on when these were built, what they look like, and what level of protection they have. So we have the early colonial buildings. That's pretty much kind of, you know, from the penal settlement 1830s through to 1870s. The early colonial buildings, from my research and from my understanding, a lot of them just don't exist anymore. So we've got these two buildings, the windmill on Wickham Terrace, and there's a museum here now. So this is the convict built store that was, just in the city. So the issue and why there's not a lot of housing around is a lot of the houses in the early colonial era were built on the ground and basically succumbed to termites. So there's really a very rare example of early colonial houses existing. If they do exist, they're generally heritage listed. So, you know, you can't touch them and you'll know about them anyway. Second from that, we have your late colonial era buildings. So these are much more common, you know, closer when you get to the city. So areas like Spring Hill, Petrie Terrace, Paddington. Late colonial buildings are generally in the pre-1911 overlay. Not all of them, and this is an issue that we'll talk about a bit later. So generally you're looking at, you know, in my opinion, the dead giveaway for a pre-1911 overlay is the detached veranda roof. So it kind of steps down, as you can see here in the image. These were drawn by Archie in our office. They basically have a detached veranda, but I mean, there's a dot point checklist here. So if we have a look at what they actually look like, these are your typical examples of a late colonial pre-1911 house. So, you know, you've got the sideways gable with the pitch, with the lean-to, you've got your detached balcony, veranda roof. So that's a typical example of a pre-1911 house. So if you come across a house that looks like this, but isn't necessarily in the pre-1911 building overlay, that's probably a red flag and means that you should be calling a town planner or someone who deals with these kinds of houses regularly, because they could be in the character overlay, but not indicatively pre-1911. So it requires a bit more investigation. Then we move on to the Federation and pre-war era. So you're kind of looking 1900s to 1930s. This is where you see the majority of pre-war, character houses throughout Brisbane. So you get your typical bungalow, your porch gable, asymmetrical bungalow, full wraparound, L-shaped verandas, single traverse gable. So here's kind of a couple of diagrams of what they might look like. I think if I go to the next slide and show you what they look like, I think everyone will be familiar with them. So these kinds of character houses are the most common that we come across. Pre-1911, every now and then, pre-1947. So these kinds of houses we come across all day, every day. And I mean, even if I look behind me in our office, there's 3 that I can see just from where I'm sitting now. So these are very common. Then we go to the interwar period. So this is where it gets a bit gray, because you start having these houses that were built kind of 1930s through to the 1960s, which are called conventional or the Spanish Mission, Mediterranean style, which don't at all look like a character house. They're not timber and tin. They're, brick and tiled roofs, but they have the same level of protection that any of those other pre-war houses have. So, you have your double gable, multi-gables, your conventional style, your more exotic looking Spanish Mediterranean buildings, Art Deco, modernist, functional kind of houses. All of these, despite them not looking like your traditional Queenslander, have the same level of protection. So if we look here, you've got your, triple gable. This era of housing is also very common in Ashgrove, where you have an Ashgrovian style of this double or triple gable, which have columns going all the way to the ground. Very high level of protection. So if you come across character houses in the Ashgrove area, there's actually a specific character house to that area that councillor put a lot of protection on. You got your Spanish ones. I mean, you wouldn't look at that ever and go, wow, look at that beautiful character house, but has the same level of protection as one of those beautiful late colonial houses. And then your more conventional buildings. So, I mean, these ones are tricky because you'll have a whole street of bungalows, and then you'll have this house, and then you'll have, the rest of the street are late colonial buildings, but this house actually has the same level of protection despite not looking like a character house at all. So make sure, even if it doesn't look like a Queenslander, you still check. So how to identify a character house? As we've just seen, it can be a little bit complicated, and you really need to know and get access to the tools to give you the best chances of success. So first of all, the building must be pre-1947 at a minimum. If it's built in 1948, it doesn't matter. Forget about it. It must be in the traditional building character overlay or pre-1911 overlay. Obviously, there's more requirements for commercial character buildings and heritage, but if it doesn't basically be those two things, so it's not if it's pre-1947 but not in those overlays, not protected. If it's not pre-1947, then it doesn't trigger it. So those 2 points are very, very crucial. And how you find out the age of a house is a lot of fun. Sometimes it can be very simple, sometimes it can be very complicated. So the first thing, the easiest thing to do is go to the Brisbane City Council interactive mapping. So there's a link for you there. I'd hope that everyone's fairly familiar with the mapping, and what I'll do is I can show you what that looks like. So I just picked a house at random. Sorry if this is your house. So if you just get the interactive mapping up, search a property just by simply typing your address up here. On your right-hand side, in the right-hand column, there's aerial imagery from 2017, 1946. So using that, you can essentially flick between them and see whether or not it looks like the same house is there. This is also a great way to be able to see what extensions might have happened to that house. So for example, this one that we're looking at, you can very clearly see that the structure at the back was never there. It's also, if it's a bit of a blurry image, it's also great to look at the spacing between the buildings to see if it's the same one. So here, you can see it's that amount of gap. They're essentially in the same line. In this one, similar gap, same line, so it's probably the same house. You can also turn off all those boundaries and things, which also make it a bit easier to see whether it's the same house or not. So you can see this house here, it's gone. So that's how to use the Brisbane City Council interactive mapping to identify a house. The trick is, if it looks like a character house, but it's not here in the imagery, it could have been moved to that premises. So it still warrants further investigation if it looks like a character house and it is in those overlays. And how you find out if they're in those overlays, in this right column, it'll say down the bottom here. So traditional building character overlay. If it's pre-1911, it'll have it somewhere else. The other great tool that the Queensland government have provided is a website called Q Imagery. So this is the link, qimagery.information.qld.gov.au, and you can essentially search a property, as we're doing right here live, and it has imagery all the way back to the 30s. So this one, unfortunately, doesn't have images back to the 30s, but we've got 1942, and turning those on, you can kind of then start building more of a picture of the age of the building, what extensions happen, when they happen. There is an issue with this. The images are not always very well lined up. Some of them are extremely blurry. So yeah, you can see this one isn't lined up at all. So generally, the best thing is to do is to find some kind of landmark and then try to find the property. So this property I know is kind of in the corner of this bend in the river. So although it's telling us it's over here, I know that it's actually probably just around here somewhere. So those two tools are extremely useful. If you can't figure out whether your properties or whether the building is pre-1911 by using those images, then there are other things you could do. This is probably where I'd recommend getting in touch with a town planner or a historian or a heritage architect. And then that way we can start reviewing, the building records, the archives, title history. You can really go as deep as you want in trying to identify the age of a character house. A great example I always use is we had one out in Wynnum, and we weren't sure whether it was pre-1911 or not. So that was the issue that we were investigating. And the conclusive evidence that was used in court was they found an ad in a news article from, I think it was 1910 or something, talking about the owner of the house rescued a boy and then noted that he lived in this certain street. So then they searched that street for any other title references or archives from the time and found that he was the only person's name who was on the street. So he must have lived there pre-1911, which means there must have been a house there pre-1911. So, if you can't find it in the interactive mapping, you can't find it in Q Imagery, there are other resources. Sometimes it's just impossible and it's just a gamble that you're going to have to take, and good luck to you, but give us a call. We can definitely help. This is the kind of thing that you can do using those images. So we had this inquiry about this property. That's it there in the bottom right corner. It does not look like a character house at all. Doesn't look like any of its original, it's brick, small, thin cladding. Here it is in the 1946 imagery. It doesn't look anything like what it is now. Then we looked at the 1960 imagery, and you can kind of see, well, that, the similar shape structure is still there, but there's this building out the side. So, it's either had big extensions done to it or it's been demolished. We then move on to 2017, and you can actually see in the roof line that this appears to be the original structure, but this section at the front's been added on, in sometime between 1946 and 1960. And then you've got this extension at the side, which is obviously not original. But if we look back at the original house in 1946, you can see there's a small outcrop on the side. So if you have a look at the imagery over here, you can actually see the original roof line. And by kind of comparing these images, we concluded that this section with the outlined in the yellow is probably actually the original pre-1947 building. So as much as this entire house and entire property is not protected, it actually is. The core of the original building is still there, and you're going to have a lot of trouble with council in playing with that. Just really quick, I've got a question. How reliable is RP data for this information? Sorry, not reliable at all. Do not trust RP data. Definitely use the council interactive mapping. So what requires approval from council? So you've got a pre-1911 building. It has to be in the pre-1911 overlay, or it has to be in the traditional building character overlay. Obviously, there's those other ones that we talked about earlier, the commercial character building and heritage, but we're just talking about these two for now. So if you have a pre-1911 building and you're in either of these overlays, basically any demolition to any part of the original house will require approval, and any extensions that are not prescribed accepted. The issue about doing prescribed accepted extensions to a pre-1911 house, generally extensions require accepted demolition to happen, and you don't have accepted demolition to pre-1911 houses. So a lot of them, if not all of them, will require approval. So you can identify whether it's pre-1911 by using those images that we referred to earlier. If you've got a pre-1947 building and it's in the traditional building character overlay, again, it has to be in the traditional building character overlay. It might be a pre-1947 building, but if it's not in those overlays, it doesn't matter. So in that instance, any demolition to any part of the original dwelling forward of the rearmost and highest point of the roofline, except where you're on a corner. So if it's on a corner, there's no such thing as prescribed accepted demolition for a character house. So it almost immediately triggers an application. Likewise, any extensions that are not prescribed accepted. So we'll talk about what prescribed accepted is shortly. The one thing that I will note, the dwelling house character overlay is not a character overlay. So as much as it has the word character in it, it's merely a trigger. It's like a residential code trigger under the regulation. So what it means is you then have to apply the dwelling house code or the dwelling small lot code. So it has nothing to do with character, despite it having the word character in it. So what is prescribed accepted development? It's what they used to call, much more simply, exempt development. So it's work that is exempt from council assessment. So that means that the building work or demolition that is prescribed accepted development does not require approval from council. The list is extremely long, and I've got a GIF image here showing just how long that list actually is. So I'm not going to go in a great level of detail about it. But what you want to do is go to the Brisbane City Council City Plan. So just Google City Plan 2014, and you want to find your way to table 5.3.4.1. So we will go through a couple of them. So for example, prescribed accepted demolition work to a character house. This is only to a character house. This doesn't exclude you from, small lot code provisions, height requirements. This is just about the character code. So first of all, for any demolition work, you've got to determine whether it's accessible anyway. So if it's going to trigger under the table of assessment, that is it forward of the rearmost and highest point of the roofline, or is it on a corner? And if you are forward of the rearmost and highest point of the roofline, are you actually removing part of the original building, or is it a post-war alteration to the original building? Which, like we just saw, you can start building a picture using the aerial imagery. Alternatively, it might just be blatantly obvious when you go there that part of the building was built in the 90s. So first of all, you want to determine if that demolition work is accessible. If it is accessible, make sure it's not prescribed accepted. So if it's not prescribed accepted, you're now then triggering a development application. So again, prescribed accepted development, just go to the table yourself, print it out, put it on your wall, put it on, save it as a PDF on your desktop. It's really important. We refer to it all day, every day. So for example, these are the kinds of things that are prescribed accepted when you're talking about demolition work. So this is just demolition work, not building work, nothing like that, just demolition. So you can raise a dwelling house, but not when you're in the La Trobe and Given terraces, or show a graceful district neighborhood plan, and the resultant building height does not exceed the building height requirements, or 9.5 meters. So you can raise a house, but you need to make sure you're not doing these things. So if you're not doing those, you don't trigger a development application. More examples, demolition of internal walls or features, external features, windows, doors, balustrades, fretwork, where you're replacing like for like, or you're restoring back to its original condition. Stairs, external stairs, lifts, ramps, freestanding outbuildings. So there's a lot of demolition work that you can do without an approval. So if we look at these images that I've marked up, this is probably the best example of what you can demolish without a permit. So if we're looking at this house, anything rear of the highest and rearmost point of the roof, which in this case is right in the center, all of that demolition does not require approval. Likewise, with this post-war addition, you can demolish that. down the side, you can demolish that. The pool can go, none of that will require assessment. So then if we look at the side, basically cutting the house in half will not require approval. The issue is, if you then want to remove this window or this window hood, then all of a sudden you're triggering a development application because it's not prescribed accepted demolition. So this, I've got a highlighted section there. This only applies if it's not pre-1911. So that's a very important part of this. You need to identify whether you think the house is pre-1911, because if it is pre-1911, then all of a sudden these exemptions don't count anymore because they all require approval. So very important. So issues, I'm guessing a lot of people have these same issues and these same questions. We come into them every single day. So when we're looking at demolition work, key issue number one, sunrooms that have been enclosed. So great example of this house. So very likely, almost not 100%, this used to be an open veranda. So at that point, are the internal walls from that technically external? Because they would have originally at one point been external walls, but now they're internal walls. So can you demolish those walls as prescribed accepted demolition? In my opinion, yes, but I guarantee council will push back on it. So you really need to push hard with council on that, because you read the exemptions and it says demolition of all internal walls. Doesn't say all original internal walls or all walls that would have been originally internal. It just says internal walls. So in my opinion, anything on the inside of this house here, inside this original sunroom, demolishing it would be exempt. Issue number two, is the house pre-1911? That is a very, very big issue. I think a lot of planners up until recently were not really advising correctly on that. So you really need to check whether the house is pre-1911, because that just basically means that there's no prescribed accepted demolition and you're likely going to trigger an application. Are the features original? So, here we're looking at probably a metal sun hood, probably not original. Some of the fretwork's probably not original. But how do you determine what it is and what isn't? So that's a massive issue. If you're really, really unsure, talk to us planners. If we're unsure, unfortunately, the only way you could do it is probably get a determination from a heritage architect to actually inspect and make a list. So if you're replacing like for like, it doesn't matter anyway. So if you're, removing this if you're unsure, you're removing and replacing it with something similar, doesn't matter. But, you should really be checking. Again, what parts are pre or post-war? Who's to say that this wasn't originally like this? I mean, an on-site inspection will likely tell you, but that is a massive issue, and really it just comes down to the discretion of whoever's looking at it. So getting second and third opinions on what is pre and what post-war parts of the house are, that's definitely worth talking to us or talking to a town planning consultant. Replacing like for like, this is, I know that I've been talking about that a little bit. The issue is, if you look at that exemption, it talks about features. So things like window hoods, fretwork, balustrading, where you're replacing like for like. What it doesn't include is integral parts of the house. So like weatherboard cladding, parts of the frame. So if you're doing an extension and to get to do it, you have to rip off some cladding, and then you're like, oh, it's too hard to put the old ones back on, I'll just put some new ones on. Technically, you might trigger a development application, and council are really starting to try to find someone to make an example of in that space. So be very cautious. So if you're replacing something, it essentially has to be damaged to be able to replace it like for like, when it's not kind of a feature, I suppose. Again, easiest way to be sure, give us a call. Then we're going into what building work you could do. So that's just demolition. So again, building work's a bit more simple than demolition. And it's basically, if the work that you're doing is not prescribed accepted, so it's not in that list under table 5.3.4.1, then it triggers a DA. It's that simple. So read the list. If you're ticking boxes and you go, well, I can't find a box to tick for this particular part of the extension or build, then it triggers a DA. So examples, building in, enclosing under an existing building to the extent of the core along the side and front and side. So there's carports, there's a lot of things you can do. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Just go to that table, read it for yourself. If you've got any questions, please ask. And then if we're looking at that same house, when we're looking at prescribed accepted building work opposed to demolition work, you can really see where you can extend. So, anything rear of the house. So if we're looking at the original house, rear of the house is behind it. So, anything in this area. So obviously we can demolish this as prescribed accepted. You can extend it. Again, down the side, you can raise it. But same thing, if you were then to push on this right-hand side over here, if you were then to push this, an ensuite just out the side here, all of a sudden you're triggering accessible demolition, accessible building work, and then you've got, a $4,000, if not more, development application on your hands. So download that prescribed accepted development list, know it like the back of your hand, and then you'll be able to help your clients and help yourself. So obviously, lots of interpretation issues when it comes to these prescribed accepted building works. The biggest ones we encounter is, building at the rear post-demolition. So obviously, if we're knocking down half this house, technically the rear of the house then becomes where you demolished. So then building out the side is technically still at the rear because it's behind the house. So it's a bit of a gray area, in all honesty. In my opinion, it's safest if you're doing something like this, like building in these yellow areas on the side here. It's just worth talking to a planner or lodging an application to council. You don't want to be caught out. I mean, the fines are much, much more severe than what the application is going to cost, and you'd be better just to have the peace of mind. The other one is building under previously enclosed rooms. So using that house from earlier, this was likely an open veranda or sunroom. So building under it, the exemption says building under the core of an existing house. So, well, this isn't the core because it was originally a sunroom, but now it's an internal room, so it's not outside. So is it part of the core now is the question. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say, because it says the core of the house, I don't think if you went under the house, you could consider that room part of the core, because it'll be likely a separate structure with different cladding, different floor materials. So it's not really part of the core of the house. So if you're building under, you're going to have to build under the actual core and not any sunrooms or verandas that have been otherwise enclosed. This is a tricky one. Demolition of stairs is exempt. So if we're looking at this old house, you can remove these stairs as exempt or prescribed accepted, no approval necessary, but there's no exemption for building a balustrade. So as much as the demolition component's exempt, when you go to put the balustrade back in, it's not prescribed accepted, so it triggers a development application. Very, very trivial, but unfortunately it is what it is. The other one we come across a lot is rear lots. So if you've got a battle axe lot, a rear lot, you've got the traditional building character overlay, unfortunately, there's no exemption. So you are going to have to lodge a development application and you are going to have to comply with the character provisions. So this is a topic that we could actually talk about for literally days. So I'm trying to keep it to under an hour. So I've made a very, very small checklist. In my opinion, if you can do these things, you will get approval very quickly, or you can avoid approval. So remember, this only applies to properties that are in the traditional building character overlay or the pre-1911 one or the commercial character, or ignoring the dwelling house character overlay, which is not a character overlay. So the checklists: 1, put a balcony overlooking the street. You can argue with council to the ends of the earth and they will still make you put a balcony in. Doesn't make sense in a lot of situations, but anyway, it is what it is. Put a balcony overlooking the street. They're trying to make them 2.5 meters deep, but I think if you make them at least 1 meter deep, then you're in for a win, or at least in a better position with council. Retaining all integral components. I can tell you right now, anything and everything is an integral component at the moment. So windows, window hoods, balconies, gables, roof lines, all of it is deemed to be integral these days. So if you can keep a window, keep it. If you can work it into the new design, keep it. If you don't have to enclose part of the balcony, don't. So yeah, that's an important one. All new materials, timber and tin, pretty straightforward. You can have some rendered weatherboard or brickwork on the lower floor, but it just has to be logical. Lightweight design, recess the garage beyond the upper story or beyond an eave, make it look lightweight. It needs to look like a Queenslander, despite your more modern Spanish, Mediterranean and Art Deco houses, it's still for some reason, if you're doing a new extension or a new build, it still has to kind of look like a bungalow essentially. Front setback needs to be within 20% of the average of the nearby pre-1947 dwellings. So just use that aerial imagery. And we've got pre and post-war demolition plans. Please make the plans as detailed and as easy to read as possible. Use colors, use images, use arrows, just make it really clear what parts of the pre-war house and what parts of the post-war house you're demolishing. So I'm running well and truly over time, so I'll jump into small lot houses. This is going to be a bit of a briefer explanation because it's not as technical and complicated. So what is a small lot? In Brisbane, it's a lot that's less than 450 square meters or a rear lot that's less than 600 square meters, excluding an access way or handle or easement. So it used to, under the old city plan, be any lot that's under 15 meters in width or frontage. It's not the case anymore. So forget about the frontage. It all has to do with the total site area. So what provisions apply? The Dwelling House Small Lot Code. So if you Google Brisbane City Council Dwelling House Small Lot Code, you will get a full list of provisions that apply. If it's not a small lot, then essentially in Brisbane, setbacks don't come into play when you're just looking at the dwelling house codes. So the only thing that would come into play is the maximum height. Otherwise, the Queensland Development Codes prevail. So I'm not going to, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but because you can read this by downloading the code. Council also have a really good interpretation guideline for small lot housing. So if you Google, Brisbane City Council interpretation guideline, small lots, then there's a very good breakdown that's easy to digest. But generally, setbacks 6 meters to the front, sides 1 meter to the wall, rear 6 meters unless it's a shallow site, in which case you can have 3 to 4.5 meters. Heights 9.5 meters and 2 stories. You can exceed 2 stories if it's a very steep slope. You can go have parts of 3 stories. Generally, I've found council will not approve something that's both exceeding 9.5 meters and more than 2 stories. It seems to be some malfunction and their brains go into meltdown if you try to do both. So don't try to do it. Just do one or the other if you have to, and only if it's a very steep site. Another one with the small lots, the maximum eave heights along the side or rear boundaries of the walls can only be 7.5 meters. So that one does trip up a lot of people. Other than that, garages need to be recessed 1 meter beyond the upper story or an eave. So for example, here, you need 2 car parks. Site coverage, generally 50%, but it changes depending on how small your lot is. The maximum building length is 25 meters. You can generally get away with more than 25 meters, so long as the parts that are exceeding 25 meters are lightweight in construction. So council aren't going to approve if you've got a 40-meter long, big monolithic brick house that's 2 stories in height. But if it's, the front 6 meters is a lightweight carport, then it steps up and there's a veranda, and then it goes to 20 meters, and then there's a 10-meter long, ground level patio. So the overall building length is 40 meters in the end, but they're all lightweight structures that aren't going to impact on people's lives. So generally you can get away with a little bit more, but it triggers a development application, and that's the issue. So again, if it's not prescribed accepted, it could be accessible is the trick with this one. So if it is accessible, it's actually self-accessible, or what they now call accepted development subject to requirements, or requirements for accepted development, which is what I like, which are called the RADs. So if it doesn't comply with the RADs, then it needs approval. But again, look at table 5.3.4.1, and there's a whole list of things that you can do outside of that code. So for example, building under an existing house, 1 unenclosed patio gazebo, 1 shed, single carport, double carport. There's a lot of things you can do. A lot of them are very intricate. You can't just go put up a double carport. It has to be 6 meters deep. What else? 1 meter, 1.5 meter side boundary setback, 2 meter front boundary setback, crossover 4.5 meters. So there's a lot of things in there that you need to take into account. So just get that table, learn it like it's gospel, and you'll be in much better place. I'll have a quick look at, there's a bit of chat going on. Let's have a look. Sorry, I'll just have a quick look. Duplexes, we're going to talk about those in the next one. Clayton, we cover all of Queensland, so happy to help. All righty. We're going to take some questions in about 5 minutes, but I thought I'd quickly go through some other issues. So flood overlays, despite being prescribed, accepted, not triggering a development application under the character codes, the small lot codes, the dwelling house character overlays, heritage, whatever it is, even if you're not triggering an application under them, there still could be another overlay. So flood overlays are a very common one. The biggest one we encounter is the overland flow paths. So if you've encountered an overland flow path, you know that the only way that we can address it is to get a hydraulic report. So you have to get a flood engineer to prepare you a document to tell you what the flood event is and how much it's going to impact the site. So unfortunately, I can't do anything more for you there. You have to get that flood report. If it's a Brisbane creek or coastal flood hazard, then use the FloodWise property reports. Just Google Brisbane City Council FloodWise property report, and you'll get a lot of information there about how high you need to build, what your finished floor levels need to be, etc. So they could still trigger a development application. It really just depends on how compliant you can be with those flood overlays. Heritage, it's not, heritage and commercial character building overlays. They're not, your traditional character overlays, but they still have a very similar effect. So look out for heritage overlays. They can still require approval. Biodiversity overlays is another one, including the natural assets, local law, and street trees. So although your property might not have a biodiversity overlay that protects trees, you might actually be affected by natural assets, local law. So if you go to the Brisbane City Council website, type in protected vegetation search, then you can do a search through the natural assets, local law and see if any of those trees are protected. All street trees are protected under that same local law. So if you've got a driveway and you want to put where a tree is, I would recommend just trying to move your driveway because it's going to be easier and more cost effective than trying to get council to move the tree. Again, another overlay, landslide hazard. If it's a steep site and subject to landslide hazard, obviously you're going to have added construction costs. We might need geotechnical reports, things like that. Other things to take into account, build over sewer or near infrastructure. Again, we encounter this frequently where people they bought a house, they're like about to put an in-ground pool in the backyard. And then the person installing the pool goes, well, what are you going to do with the sewer running through the back right where you want to put the pool? So just make sure you're looking at these things. Urban utilities, you can use dial before you dig to do free searches. There's a lot of online content about that. Combine drains are another big issue when it comes to extensions and new houses in character overlays generally, or houses in general. And the biggest issue we encounter is that generally a combine drain, which is a private sewer main, so it's not owned by urban utilities, it's basically owned by each individual person that it's land who runs through. The issue is you can only have so many pipes going in or so many drains going into that combine drain. So if you exceed that, you might not be able to put in an ensuite because you can't connect into that drain. Very, very much recommend looking into the combine drain issue. If it's not a small lot, make sure you're still checking the Queensland development codes, because as much as a character overlay requires assessment, you're not necessarily assessing any setbacks. So we could get an approval from council for a building. Everyone's happy, councils are happy. We get through to the building approval with the certifier, and there's a lot of certifiers here I saw, so you'll know this. Get to the certification, they go, well, I can't get approval for that reduced boundary. So sorry, you're going to have to change your plans, and then we have to go all the way back to planning again. So make sure you're still checking your Queensland development codes. Similar issue, check your fire rating issues. Very similar. The biggest one we encounter is people raising a house. So you've got a house, the side setbacks, in Petra Terrace, some of them are on the boundary. As soon as you raise it, you might actually trigger requirements for fire separation and fire compliance along that boundary. So all of a sudden you have to rip off all the cladding, get rid of all the windows and replace it with some kind of fire rated material, which triggers a massive development application, which might be hard to get approval for. So just take those into account. So that brings us to the question part. Before we get in there, I thought I'd just put my details up. If you need anything from us, obviously get in contact. That's my direct email address. Add me on LinkedIn. I put a lot of valuable content like this up on LinkedIn, and register for our next masterclass. So if you've been to this one, you're going to get an email seeing if you want to come to the next one. And from the feedback that we got, we're going to do the next one on dual occupancy, auxiliary units, and granny flats. And that's going to be a Queensland-wide masterclass. So some other resources, check out properties. That's the web address there. Check out ERPEC. If you really, you can use ERPEC to do CPD points. You can use it to upskill yourself. You can use it if you're a student to, upskill to have some more things on your resume to put yourself in a position above your peers to get a job. So There's my details. Let's jump into some questions. I see there's 8 questions in here. So if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A box. We've got, what, 13, 14 minutes. So Brian's asked, with the character overlay, can you argue if there is a character house, but the area has no character to allow removal or demolition? So the question that Brian's asking is, if you are the only character house on the whole street and you're in those overlays, will council let you demolish it? The short answer is no. There is part of the demolition code part of the reason why you can approve a demolition house, council can approve the demolition of a house, is if there's absolutely no streetscape. So it has no contribution to anything. It's completely useless being in the street. If anything, it's an eyesore because you're going down the street, modern houses, then there's a character house. So generally you should be able to argue for it to be removed or demolished, but if you try, I can almost guarantee council will refuse it and you'll have to appeal it. And the reason being is because they did that community consultation, and it would be like them going directly against what the community want. So they don't want to be seen to be doing that. So they're just going to refuse it, let the courts decide. Jeff has asked, does this mean no character house can be demolished? Kind of. So if it's in a character overlay and it's pre-war, it is very, very, very hard for them to be demolished. You can apply for them. Likely council will refuse it. And you'll have to appeal it. Not to say that we don't get them approved, we certainly do, but I'll be honest, it's been a while. And we get experts right at the get-go to give us feedback. So we get the same expert witnesses who they use in court to give us a report in the application, and council still refuse it, even though they know they're likely going to lose in an appeal. The reason being they just don't want to be liable for making that decision. Oh, look at that. I should have read the next one. Apparently, I've already answered that. Christopher Evans, best advice for getting neighbours on board. How much does their consent carry with council? In context of small lot stuff, I mean, in theory, getting the neighbours' consent for your build doesn't do anything except for maybe a built to boundary wall. But if you've got a big building, if you can give council consent from the neighbours to show that, you know, everyone surrounding my property wants this to happen, that can give us a lot of argument. So that essentially gives us the power to say, council, you're acting on the best interests of the community. And guess what? We've collected the community's opinion and they all want this to happen. So it kind of takes the liability of them making that decision away from them and helps us argue that approval. So as much as it doesn't carry lawful weight, it definitely helps us build an argument by getting neighbours on board for whatever you're doing. That applies for anything too, not just for character houses, not just for small lot houses, but also for subdivisions, units, whatever it is. All right, Claude, you've got one about generally in accordance here. So the question is, where does generally in accordance sit where a planning approval has been obtained for work on a character house? For example, the approval might involve changes to a part of an existing veranda requiring reconstruction of the balustrade. If the original balustrades are below the building code height, the certifier would need to require all the balustrades to be brought up to the current height. So generally in accordance, unfortunately, under the current Act doesn't exist. So they've actually removed it from the Planning Act, whereas it was under the Sustainable Planning Act. But Council, Brisbane just released an interpretation guideline about what generally in accordance means now. And what they've basically said is that it has absolutely no weight in law. So as much as you can make a discretion, you can make a decision based on your own discretion. If someone complains that balustrade and it's low and it's not on the plans as being higher, then it's not generally in accordance and you need to do a minor change to the existing approval. So be very careful when it comes to generally in accordance things, because ultimately the liability sits with whoever is the person who said that it's generally in accordance. Not to say that you'll always get in trouble. I actually think you'll be very unlikely get into trouble, but you could, and that's the issue. Alexandra's asked, on a corner lot less than 450 square meters, what setbacks are used apart from the primary and secondary frontages? Great question. The question is whether you have two sides, or do you have a rear boundary, or do you have two rear boundaries? The answer is you don't have a rear boundary because you've got two sides and you've got two frontages. So in that instance, the setbacks would be 1 meter to both rear boundaries. So anything that's not a front boundary would be a side. So I think that should hopefully answer that question. Christopher Evans has asked, is now a good or a bad time to engage Brisbane City Council? How is Brisbane City Council behaving currently given the massive construction? Are they harder to pass, slower to approve? Are things, getting through? It's never not a good time. It's never not a bad time to apply for an application to council. In my opinion, just get it in because you never know what's going to happen in the future. It could get worse, could get better. You don't know, just lodge it. Currently, Brisbane City Council are still doing pretty good, really, considering the workload. So I know that we speak to a lot of the planners in there on their working weekend, late nights, trying to get things out. So they are being incentivized internally to work longer hours to get things out the door. What we are finding is just your general list of unnecessary information request points. They don't have as much time to review internal feedback. So you might get this feedback from the architect that's not relevant whatsoever. And then it'll be in the information request and they'll be arguing with us about it. And we'll just go, well, look, that's not even accessible. Why are we talking about it? And then, they go off, come back 20 minutes later and kind of agree. So that's probably the issue that we're finding. But generally, we're still getting pretty decent outcomes. Reese has asked, how much time? We have 7 minutes. Reese has asked, for raising and building under a character house, are there ways to mitigate building underneath the front veranda that'll keep BCC happy? Generally, the way to keep BCC happy with building under a house is just to not build under the front verandas. That's pretty much it. Council will try to, if you lodge an application trying to do that, then they'll just ask you to not do it. So obviously you can recess it a bit. So if you have to, try to only build under part of it. So you kind of retain that lightweight appeal and lightweight, structure. But the best way to avoid it is just to avoid approval altogether and just not build under the patio or upstairs balcony. Joe has asked, what are the minimum lot size to comply with new car parking 10% deep planning in LMR? So that's probably, unfortunately, Joe, more of a question relating to multiple dwellings, which would be, another masterclass we're going to have to do in the future. So sorry about that. We have an anonymous attendee. Okay, the question is, if the 1946 aerial photos show the house under construction, how is this treated for alterations, demolition if it's technically post 1946? So most of the aerial imagery in Brisbane from that 1946 aerial imagery was done in May. So you can actually have buildings that were built after May in the same year. So they're still technically built in 1946 and protected. So like I said, if it looks like it's a character house, then ask some questions, talk to a planner, ask council, do some research, see if you can find out the exact date. If it's under construction in 1946, I would just generally assume that the whole house is protected. So don't touch it. It's going to be impossible to try to figure out what parts of it are protected, what parts weren't protected. So generally, safest advice, just assume it's all protected and the whole thing's an original house. You can also use Q imagery to look at the later images, see if you can find one from 1949. I think there's a lot of images, see how much of it's built there, because if it's at framing stage in 1946 and then in 1949, it's still at framing stage, then you can say that, well, the only thing that's protected is the frame. Abbas has said, if the house is termite damaged to 98% and structurally unsound, can it be demolished? Generally, the answer is yes. It will require approval still, and you really, really have to have thorough documentation about how structurally unsound it is from a structural engineer, and you need to demonstrate that it's going to be much, much more expensive to restore than it is going to be to rebuild, to demolish and rebuild. So it's a very tricky one. I always recommend just getting in contact with the town planner when you're looking at structural unsound buildings and termite damage in character houses. Edward has asked, how long does a successful court appeal victory last for? So the victory, if you do go through court and you do get an approval, will last for the same time frame that it would be if it was a normal approval. So generally for material change of use, you're looking at 6 years. For building work, it's 2 years. So if you get approval for demolition, you still have 2 years from that point to demolish your house. All right, how are we going for time? 4 more minutes. Should be able to get there. Sean has asked, can houses be moved on a block? For example, from the front block on a main street as far back as possible to avoid traffic noise, or do houses have to remain visible from the main road? So I'm guessing that's relating to character houses, Sean. So if you look at that list of prescribed accepted work, so get that table up. I feel like I'm I need to stop saying that, but have a look at that table of prescribed accepted development. There is a section there about moving houses, and essentially you need to stay within that 20% setback of other houses, other pre-war houses in the street. So as soon as you go outside of that 20%, so generally, you know, between 4.5 and 7.2 meters, as soon as you go further back than that, you're going to trigger a development application, and council's just not going to approve it because you're removing that house from its original location and you're taking away its original contribution to the traditional streetscape. So you can move it around sideways, backwards, forwards, but it has to remain within that 20% of the average setback of pre-war houses in the same street. Jeff has asked, I have 2 adjacent character houses in my area with many units nearby. Presumably, I would never obtain DA to demolish the house and build units. Jeff, it depends. If you've got the character overlays, then yes, it would be hard to demolish them. But that being said, council have specifically zoned or specifically not put character overlays in areas that are intended for higher density development. So you'll see a lot through Kangaroo Point where character houses are just getting bulldozed and big blocks of units are going up, and then it's kind of annoying the community quite a bit. But you know, the reason being is you wouldn't get the density unless you allowed the removal of some of these character houses. So it just depends on the site-specific circumstances, Jeff, but flick us an email. I'm happy to have a look at whether or not those specific houses are protected, and then what your chances of success are. Generally, if it's in an LMR zone and there's just townhouses around, you have to keep them, and it's going to be very hard to get them demolished. All right, we have one more question with 2 minutes to go. Owen Page has asked, can a house be demolished that resides in the dwelling house character zone, not the traditional building character, even though the house is pre-1947? So yes, so that's what I was talking about earlier. The dwelling house character overlay is not a character overlay. So it's called dwelling house character. It's got the word character in there, has nothing to do with pre-war houses. It just, you'll actually find the dwelling house character overlay is on any block that has a dwelling on it. So it actually covers almost the whole of Brisbane. So yes, you can demolish that building, even if it is pre-1947. Again, I would just double check because you just never know you just never know. So definitely give us a call, or, you know, it doesn't have to be us, could be someone else. Just make sure you check, because the one thing you do not want to be doing is being part of a decision or part of the consultant team that approved a house being demolished without appropriate consents. Alrighty, so I think that takes us to a close. If anyone else has any further questions, please feel free to get in touch. Someone's lost sound. I know it seems to be going okay. So yes, thank you very much for attending. I really hope you all got a lot of value out of that. Please, if you've got any further questions, get in contact with our office. Please send an email. Try not to call, because as you can imagine, we've had 300 people register for this event, so we can't have 300 people calling us at the same time. So flick an email through. This has been recorded, and it will be emailed to everyone that's registered to attend. So you will get a copy of this in your inbox shortly. And please register for the next one. If you have any ideas for upcoming masterclasses, let us know. There's a suggestion box on our website, and we'd love to help out. Oh, awesome. Answered that question. Cool. Well, I'll leave it there. Everyone, have a wonderful Tuesday. Thank you for all the thank yous in the chat bar. I look forward to doing the next one, and everyone have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye.